Hey guys, I'm Willie McBride, and today we're going to talk about the 29er and how the top teams make the jump to the next level. And so often in the 29er, the answer to that question has a lot to do with boat speed. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at some videos of top teams going upwind in different conditions and look at what it is that they do that makes the boat go fast and that gives them that little edge in speed. So let's go ahead and start here. We're looking at underpowered conditions, really light. You can see that on the water, we've got texture, but maybe just barely, a little bit choppy, a little bit wavy. And I think one of the most important things here when we're looking at underpowered conditions is that the top teams capture as much power as they possibly can in the mainsail without stalling. So what I like to think about is that there are only two reasons that you should ever ease the main in the 29er or in any boat, really. Those two reasons are it's overpowered and we've got to keep the boat flat, or we've got to control the heel angle. That would be the first reason to ease. That's the one that most people think of. The second reason to ease, if it's underpowered conditions, we're not trying to control the heel angle with the main sheet. Instead, the second reason to ease the main is if the mainsail wants to stall. So if we look up at the telltales on the main and that top leech telltale wants to stall, we can ease the main right there for just a second, and that's going to allow the leech to open back up. And that's going to prevent the sails from stalling. So in this underpowered condition, the only reason we're easing the main is to prevent it from stalling. So when we look at this video, you can see that it's pretty active on the main sheet, actually, right? You can see the crew is going through quite a bit of sheet here. And the reason for that in this underpowered condition is this sea state. So as we go through here, we can see a little wave comes under the boat. There might be a little piece of chop right there. Another piece of chop, another wave. And so every time we hit a piece of chop, that's going to slow the boat down. And the sails are going to stall more easily when the boat is slow. The apparent wind is going to shift back and the sail is going to want to stall there. So when we hit chop, we've got to be easing main a little bit. And then as we've eased it, the boat's going to get back up to speed and we can squeeze it back in. The other thing that's going on here is we're sailing up these kind of rolling waves. And at the top of the rolling waves, we have a little bit more pressure. So we might have to ease a little bit for the pressure at the top just to control the heel as we move weight to keep the power in the boat. But the most important thing in these underpowered conditions to think about is that as the crew, you really want to be doing as much of the adjustment as possible with your weight. So you can see, boom, there, crew hits full extension. They're moving weight super frequently, all the way from in here on the mast to that full extension position. And when you're going through that much range in weight movement, you're able to really, the way I think about it is that there's so much power in the wind, and you're trying to kind of capture every little bit of that power that you possibly can. Let's go to the next sequence here. And so you can see this main sheet range is pretty small. It's like maybe 4 to 6 inches. It looks a little bit bigger on this camera, but look at how big that block is, right? It's a pretty small range on the main sheet. Oh, we're going slow-mo here. Back it up here. So it's a pretty small range on the sheet, and we're doing most of the adjustment with weight. So one way that I like to think about the 29er is that we have 3 things that we're always adjusting. We're always adjusting weight, we're always adjusting sheet, and we're always adjusting steering. Those are the 3 things that we kind of have to work with here. We'll find another. Okay, new crew. Let's compare the differences here. Sailing up this big wave, Main sheet super static, right? Weight movement is pretty good. Weight movement is still really active. But you can see this crew is not quite getting those same full extensions. They're a little bit more static with weight even. And the reason for that is that we're not allowing the boat to go fast in the moments where it's getting slow by easing the sheet and then squeezing the power back on. So what I like to say is in the underpowered conditions, we're going to hit chop and we're going to have to move weight in and ease at the same time to make sure that the sails don't stall. And if we do that at the right time, we're immediately going to be able to start squeezing the sheet back on and squeezing with weight. So it's in and ease and then trim and squeeze with weight. In and ease, trim and squeeze. So right here we see we're trying to press weight out. We're squeezing the sheet on as we do. Trying to be kind of max trim all the way out there with our weight. And then if we get to a place where the boat kind of gets slow, we hit chop, weight comes back in, we ease the sheet there, get the boat going again, and now we're extending weight again right away, and we're able to kind of squeeze to that 2-block point. They're kind of a big puff hits. We're ripping and we're getting to the top of a wave where that big puff hits. So we might have to ease a little bit. If that was happening all the time, we'd probably go for a little bit of bang. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at what that looks like from behind the boat here. So I'm gonna stop sharing this one. And we're going to go over to this photo first, these two photos. So in these photos here, on the left-hand side, we see a really deep, twisty leech setup on this boat. And on the right-hand boat, we see a flatter setup with a straighter leech where the top of the sail is trimmed in a lot more. And the only difference between these two boats in these two pictures is the amount of main sheet tension that they have on. So in the left-hand picture, the bridle height is a little bit higher and we're trimming to 2-block on the main, but it's not, the bridle's not low enough for us to actually be able to trim the top of this main. The 29er main relative to most other junior classes is super roachy, which means that it has a lot of sail kind of sticking out far from the mast up high here. And because of that, we really need to be able to trim tight to close the leech off over here in the right-hand picture. So the difference between these two is that we've moved the bridle a little bit lower on this right-hand image, and we're able to squeeze main sheet tighter. We're able to close down the leech up top. And what we're looking at when we're sailing the boat in these two setups is we're looking at these leech telltales, the ones up top, kind of the top leech telltale and the second leech telltale. And in this left-hand image, you can see them both flying. And if we trim to 2-block, we probably can't stall them because the bridle's too high. In the picture on the right, we've dropped the bridle. We're trimming a lot tighter. And you can't really see the telltales in this picture. But at this point here, in this super flat water, we might still be flowing on those telltales, but we're right on the edge. And if we hit a piece of chop, we're going to have to ease. Otherwise, those things are going to stall the way we were looking at in that other video. We're going to have to go in and ease. And then immediately when that happens, the boat's going to start getting back up to speed and we can start squeezing the main sheet back on and start squeezing with weight. So it's in and ease, trim and squeeze. And those telltales tell you a lot about what's going on in the sail up high. This is one of the most common mistakes that I see teams make in the 29er, especially when they're kind of in that mid-level in underpowered conditions, but they haven't quite broken into the top couple of teams yet. I see a lot of teams sailing around with their bridles too high and they can't get their leech to close. They either have to pull Vang on to get it to close, and then that flattens the sail out a ton, or they're just sailing around twisty like this all the time. So one of the most important things you can do to kind of make that transition from this underpowered kind of middle of the pack look to underpowered top of the fleet look is to drop your bridle and to learn how to use those top telltales to look up there quite often to see, can you get those telltales to stall? And if you can't, we need to drop the bridle. Another really important factor that I see when I see teams trying to sail in underpowered conditions is trapeze height. So let's take a look here at trapeze height. Let's see how this.
You can see right here how close that leech is, how tight that leech is, and that's exactly what we're looking for.
So we're talking right now, again, about this main leech, and we're talking about, okay, this is where we've dropped the bridle. You can see how low that bridle is right here. We're eased a couple of inches. And if we squeeze that last couple of inches on, it really closes down.
Just how tight that leech is, and that's exactly what we're
here. We've got a pretty nice leech there. We've actually got a couple more inches to squeeze. So we could get this leech even straighter, but you can see the top telltales are flying. And one of the things in this video that you see is that the crew is dropped super low on the wire. They're like parallel to the water almost. And this is something that I think is really important and sometimes overlooked. If you raise yourself up on the wire, think about if you bend your knees and you can shorten your legs by, let's say, 2 feet. Well, half of that knee bending that you're doing is getting your body in, and that's making it so that you can move weight in and not heel to windward. But half of the knee bending that you're doing is just kind of moving you down. And so instead of standing up straight, you're kind of getting closer to the boat, right? So if you drop all the way till you're parallel to the water, when you bend and unbend your knees, if you bend and unbend 2 feet again, now all of that 2 feet is getting you farther from the boat or closer to the boat. So you can adjust weight so much faster if you're dropped on the wire like this. And you've got to watch out, because if you're dropped on the wire, you have to be really precise with the weight movement, right? It's easy to move too much and to overcompensate and to accidentally pull the boat to windward or to accidentally let the boat go to leeward. But the top teams get really good at sailing really low on the wire like this because they can move weight more quickly. And that allows them to sail tighter on the main sheet, like we were talking about before, and closer to the edge of stalling without the boat heeling back and forth, because they're using weight now to control the heel of the boat. So let's watch that for just a minute here. See how that goes. And one of the things I like here is that the skipper is getting involved as well. The skipper is getting active, and the skipper is kind of helping the crew to move that weight quickly, right? So one of the rules of thumb that I like to think about is that you want the crew dropped on the wire, and you want to get them dropped early. So if it's super light, the skipper will stay close to centerline to allow the crew to drop. That's the first rule of thumb. But the second rule of thumb is you want the crew as far forward in the boat as you possibly can have them in these underpowered conditions for as long as you can have them there, because the pointy part of the boat, the V part of the boat, is going to be way less drag in this underpowered condition. So what that means is that if the skipper can come up on the rail and start hiking, it can help to keep the boat flat and help to keep the crew forward. Because if the crew has to hike harder, they have to step back onto the wing. And you don't really want that in these underpowered conditions. You want the crew weight as far forward as possible to sail the boat on that pointy V part of the bow in displacement mode. And that's going to change once we get to overpowered conditions. So let's take one look at one more video here before we get to the overpowered conditions. And the next video that we're going to look at, I've got to pull it up here, is a video of transitional conditions. So this is kind of going to be as the breeze is building from the underpowered conditions into the overpowered conditions. We're going to have a little while where the breeze is kind of moderate. And let me pull this video up. All right, so here we're looking at this transitional condition where the breeze is not quite underpowered, but it's not quite overpowered. And what we can see here is coming off the line, we've got this team on the left, and they're actually heavier than any other team in the frame here. But you can see the skipper's hiking as hard as he can, the crew's hiking as hard as he can. And back here, we've got two boats where the skipper here is sitting in, the crew is kind of up, not really hiking hard. Here, the crew is bending their knees, the skipper is out a little bit. So in these transitional conditions, it's really important to have your bridle low enough to be able to trim on and squeeze that leech and trim the top of the sail to generate a little bit of extra power. And you can see you start to get this overbend wrinkle in the sail that goes from the spreaders down to the clew of the main. And when we're trimming the main super tight in these conditions, that's going to be the thing. And actually here, let me back up to the team that's hiking hard. You can see right here that overbend wrinkle start to form. Skipper's handing off the main sheet here. And hiking super hard and trimming the main hard here is going to just generate a little bit of extra power for this boat that allows them to drive the boat forward when the boats on their hip here are kind of in that mode where they're moving weight still because they're underpowered. So the sooner we can get to full power, the faster we're going to be. And the way we do that is by trimming the sails really tight with no controls on. And that's going to allow us to hike hard. The hard part about that is that it makes the boat really tippy and really sensitive to any kind of puff that hits. So we've got to get really good at moving our weight in a really precise way. All right, let's go ahead and switch gears here. And we are going to start looking at some driving force conditions. So we're getting into overpowered conditions here. Let's pull up this video. And we're going to look at a couple of different sail setups going upwind. So here's the first one. I'm just going to let it play. Super twisty. Playing the main in a really small range right there to keep the boat flat. And once we get into these driving force conditions, the most important thing is going to start to be keeping the boat dead flat and sailing the boat on its planing surface. So more on the back of the hull. We're going to look at that in just a sec. But these are all pretty good looks. These guys finished top 10 at the Worlds in Long Beach. Here they're going upwind outside in Long Beach and a little bit of chop. You can see crews hiking super hard, playing the main sheet quite a bit, staying active. Something that I really like about this video here is that the skipper is pretty active with her weight, with her shoulders. You can see she's moving weight forward and backward in the chop, throwing her shoulders at the top of pieces of chop. because when that boat slows down, when the boat hits chop and wants to slow down, if you throw your shoulders right there, you can kind of open the leech up for just a second and get the boat to reaccelerate really quickly. So hitting max hiking at the tops of the pieces of chop is really important. Right here, you can see, okay, these guys finished top 10 at the Worlds in Long Beach. They've got a pretty straight leech. They're banging pretty hard. Whoops. They're banging pretty hard here. And so it's very firm and pretty straight on the leech here, very firm down low. And then in contrast, we're going to see this next boat are actually the people who won the gold medal at the Worlds in Long Beach. And they're sailing a little bit twistier. That's going to be a little bit more forgiving setup, especially in this choppy, wavy water that you see them sailing through. This little twistier setup is going to make the boat a little bit easier to sail, a little bit more forgiving. You can see they're still really active on the main. They fire it out super quickly when they hit chop to get the boat to reaccelerate. And the helmsman is actually driving pretty aggressively here. So I think this is a really good view of what those top teams are doing in wavy, challenging conditions to keep the boat flat, to keep the boat on its feet. You can see how active the leech is up here. When you hit that chop, the leech is kind of releasing for you. Right there, right there. And so you're just trying to manage the main sheet to keep the boat dead flat through all of that. You can see body position here. Crew is standing about a foot back from the corner of the wing there. And I think that's a really good reference point that everybody should get used to looking at, is how far back from the corner of that wing are you? And then the skipper is really nice and pushed up next to the crew here. And that's going to help the boat kind of settle when it's pitching in waves. It's going to settle more quickly if your weight is together instead of being super spread apart. All right, let's go ahead and we're gonna go to a little more close up here. And we're gonna look at that, playing the sails to keep the boat flat. So here's our video. Let's see what that looks like. So you can see pretty active on main sheet. Really trying to sail the boat dead flat, even a little bit of weather heel at times. And I think one of the things that I like to see is anytime you ease, it should be followed by a little trim. It doesn't need to be a big trim. It shouldn't be a big trim. It should be an ease, but then immediately starting to squeeze the sheet back on, because the moment you ease, the boat's starting to reaccelerate. The boat's starting to go faster. Either a puff hit and you're easing because the puff hit and the boat's starting to go faster, or you hit a piece of chop and you're easing because the apparent wind shifted back and now the boat's starting to reaccelerate. So anytime you're easing, the boat's starting to reaccelerate. And what that means is that it's really important that the sheet starts to squeeze back on, because when the boat accelerates, the apparent wind starts to shift back forwards. And we need to be squeezing to make sure that the apparent doesn't get too far forwards and the boat doesn't come to windward after that. All right, let's go ahead and listen to some of the communications through that upwind groove here. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up another video from the head cam this time. Here we go. And let's hear what this sounds like.
Yeah. Here's pressure.
Pressure is in front of us. Next 20. Here's pump, then a low. And then most pressure here, 2, 1. Big pressure. Working it high in here. Want to stay in this long. Big wind line coming. Fast forwards to the wind line.
So let's talk about this real quick. A couple things that I really like. So we're talking about pressure. We're talking about puffs. We're talking about lulls. I think one thing that's really important is that it's equally important to talk about puffs and lulls, right? Everybody likes to call the puffs. Everybody sees the dark water and they're like, okay, puff in 3, 2, 1. But it's probably more important in my mind to call the lulls in the 29er, because when the lull hits, that's the moment that the main sheet's got to come on. Otherwise, the boat wants to crash to windward, and that's super slow. So talking about pressure, talking about lulls, counting down to the next puff. But one of the things that I think is really important here that everybody should be taking away from this is that in addition to talking about what's coming next, what they're seeing, they're talking about what mode they're going to use to get to it. So if he's saying there's pressure in front of us, they're making the distinction between pressure that's in front, like out here in front of the boat, that we could go bow down and go fast to and get there a little bit sooner, or pressure that's on top, pressure that, you know, you're looking over your shoulder and it's over your shoulder coming down above you. And if pressure is coming down above you, if pressure's on top of you, then the high mode is probably going to be the mode that gets you there a little bit sooner. So they're talking about the pressure that they're seeing, and they're also talking about the modes. And I think this is something that I really want crews to do, is don't just make observations, make an observation and then kind of give an opinion on, like, this is what I think is going to get us there sooner, or this is what I think the best move is for us right now.
Or bang, or kind of.
Or bang, or kind of. So the crew is feeling what he's feeling in the sheet, and he's giving that input to the skipper.
Pressure here.
We need some more control, easing off of center line here, right? If you're consistently easing off of center line, a little more controls is going to help the boat go faster in this overpowered condition.
Okay, feels like fast forward.
It's like fast forward. He's saying, I think the way to get to the next pressure is to keep the knot out.
A little ball and then more pressure coming. Here's more pressure coming in 3, 2. Big pressure here, 2, 1. Big pressure coming in 5, 3, 2, 1. Working high in this.
Working high in this. He thinks that high mode is going to be working pressure.
2.
One of the things you can see here from a speed standpoint is you can see this knuckle. So the part where the bow turns the corner, we call that the knuckle. In these overpowered conditions, you want that knuckle just kind of kissing the water. Any more in the water than that, and it's extra drag, because we're trying to sail on this flat part of the hull back here now that we're in these overpowered conditions. We're trying to be planing, but we don't want a big gap between that. Otherwise, we're kind of popping a wheelie and we're digging the back of the boat in. So that's a really good reference point to kind of keep in mind. If you're the crew, you can see that really well, and you can figure out where your weight should be relative to that corner of the boat, like we were talking about before.
1 more pressure. Fast forwards. Pressure here. More pressure coming.
All right. Cool. So the communication, and using that communication to make sure that you're on the same page with your teammate, and making sure that you're using your modes to get to the next pressure sooner is really, really important. Okay, so let's pull up one more video here and let's look at what I would call kinetics. So right here, we're looking at a team who's going to be working the boat pretty hard here. Okay, we're sailing upwind in chop, and we're looking at this knuckle position again of the bow. And here the knuckles, we're sailing in choppier conditions. So the knuckles kind of in and out of the water a little bit more than it was in the last video that we looked at, where we were sailing in super flat water in Coronado Bay. So right here, we come out the back of a piece of chop, and you can see how detached that knuckle gets from the water. So the rule of thumb that I want everybody thinking about is that we want that knuckle at a consistent height out of the water all the time. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to move weight fore and aft. So in this case, the crew here, we can see, is kind of working his weight forwards and backwards as we go through this chop. Here he's kind of in his base position, and there he kicks forwards, right? They go through a piece of chop, and boom, he steps forward and steps back, just to keep the bow connected through the chop, forwards and back, to get the boat to kind of settle after it's gone through that piece of chop. So the first forward and back was to keep the bow from getting too far out of the water. There he does it again. And you can see that timing was really nice. The boat starts to kind of jump off the back of this wave, and he kicks forward just as it does. And then as the bow starts coming back down to the water, he's already back in his position to prevent it from digging too much. So this fore and aft weight movement, really important to kind of settle the boat and prevent it from seesawing upwind. All right, guys, hopefully that's a good look at some tips and tricks for underpowered conditions, where we want to make sure that we're trimming main super tight and that we're using weight to keep the boat flat. We've got to get the bridle to the right height, and we're going to use those top telltales to do that. And we're going to sail as far forwards with our weight as we possibly can to keep the bow in the water and keep the boat sailing on this displacement part of the hull, the pointy V part of the boat. Then once it gets a little bit breezier, we're going to keep trimming those sails tighter, and that's going to allow us to get to full power sooner than the boats around us. That's what we were looking at when we were looking at that transitional condition. And finally, we get into the overpowered conditions. We get into this driving force. And in the driving force, we've got to keep the boat flat. We've got to keep the boat sailing on the planing surface in the back of the boat. We can do that by looking at the knuckle of the bow, by moving weight to keep the knuckle attached. We determine how critical the sail setup can be based on the amount of chop, based on the waves. If it's super flat water, we can have a really closed leach. We can be sailing with a lot of bang and not that much Cunningham. If it's wavier and choppier, we need more Cunningham and less bang, and that's going to make the sails twistier and more forgiving. And the skippers need to be pretty active with their weight. They need to be throwing their shoulders around and making sure that we're hitting max height at the top of every piece of chop to help the boat re-accelerate when it slows down in that chop. Hopefully all those tricks make sense. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to Steve or I. And hopefully that helps you kind of take your game to the next level and find that extra little bit of speed in the 29er.